So I've been meaning to make a video on some software that I use for my astrophotography. There are a group of amateur astronomers that decided to make their own version of sequencing software because they just weren't really thrilled with the results they were getting with other software, or just felt like they needed better features, or whatever the reason. They went ahead and made their own software. And it's called N.I.N.A, or Nighttime Imaging and Astronomy. And they're open source, it's free, you can grab it right off the internet. Here's their website. You can see it is nighttime-imaging.eu, and you can go there and grab the latest version of it. In my case, I'm still using version 1.9, but they do have a new nightly build out here. So they're constantly working on it, constantly updating, making fixes, and adding little features here and there based on feedback. So it's a really active new tool. Now, there are other tools out there. Sequence Generator Pro is a really popular one, but it is not free. Some other tools like Astrophotography Tool or APT have some of these things built in as well. But I decided to go ahead and grab this version of a sequencing tool, something that's going to integrate all these different things together into one package. And as you start getting into astrophotography and you end up getting a little bit more in depth into your setup and getting to the target, having something like N.I.N.A is going to be extremely helpful. Let me go ahead and bring up N.I.N.A. I have this installed, and I actually have it running on my remote computer right now. I've got a little stick computer attached to my mount. And so this is actually remote desktoped into that computer. Now I've got everything set up. It's all turned on. And if I want to, I can go ahead and fire it up. Before I do that, though, I want to mention a few things about the initial setup of N.I.N.A. So first things first, when you go into N.I.N.A and you set up your options, there are a few things that you're really going to want to make sure that you do. I go into my options and I'll make a new profile for any equipment combination that I want: camera, telescope. Do I have a reducer or flattener involved? How much? This all helps me make sure that I get everything set up, and I can quickly switch between profiles when I change equipment. So that's something that I'll do. And I've got a few already put together here, but I've just made a new one. When you have that selected and it's active, you've loaded it, you can make sure you go give it a name. Call it whatever you want. And then you can choose to point towards, if you download the optional Sky Atlas image directory, so that when you search for stuff offline, it may actually come up with a picture, which is pretty cool. Again, that's optional. You can customize the color scheme to anything that you want. And you'll also want to make sure that you input specifically your coordinates, your latitude and longitude. This is in decimal, so don't use the degrees, minutes, seconds, use decimal. And you can grab that from something like Cartes du Ciel or Stellarium if you're using those, or you can grab it from GPS if you're using a GPS enabled device, which I am not. Once you've got this part done, you can move over to equipment and you can set up a few things. So specifically pixel size and some information just about your camera, the bit depth of your raw images, and your general full well capacity. You don't need to do the full well capacity, but that can help with a few other things like the flats wizard and stuff like that. You can also adjust and set up your telescope, so you would tell it whatever you have. So if you've got, say, a Celestron RASA 8-inch or something like that, you can go ahead and add in a name, focal length, whatever that happens to be, and focal ratio, if that happens to be correct. I don't know. I don't have a RASA. But anyway, you put in your telescope information. You can choose to input information if you're using automatic focusing or using filter wheels. If you're using guiding through PhD2, you would want to make sure that you also set this up over on the side here. So we can put in some information about the equipment. Then for imaging, we would go in and set up a file path and a pattern for how you want it to name your pictures. Where do you want them stored? So you might change a few things in here, like I use a DSLR. I don't need to have sensor temperature in there, so I'll take that out. And you can input anything else you want. They have little snippets on the bottom there too, so if you want, you can just double click on these and it'll go ahead and add that into the path for you. Pretty straightforward. DSLRs, you can see it'll always be saved in its native RAW format. For your mount, if you're imaging, do you want it to do automated meridian flips? We can turn that on if you'd like. You can also tell it some information about previewing or taking quick snapshots for getting things set up. How do you want it to deal with the imaging? Plate solving is another fantastic feature I highly recommend if you're going to use N.I.N.A or Sequence Generator Pro or APT or whatever tool. If it has plate solving, use it. This has completely revolutionized the way that I image because now I don't have to hunt for anything. My system has backlash in it. When I tell it to go and point at something, it'll turn and it'll get close, but it's not going to get it spot on. It might be off a little bit, it might be off a bunch. And the best part about plate solving is it will automatically find the center for you. It'll figure out where it's actually pointed, sync up with your mount, tell it what the coordinates really are, and then it will adjust the scope to point exactly where you want it. So highly recommend using plate solving if you can. I use the recommended solver from the folks who built N.I.N.A called ASTAP. And so when you select that, you also want to make sure you select your plate solver settings and tell it exactly where you have ASTAP installed. You can get ASTAP from their general website. I've got their website here. This is hnsky.org/astap.htm. You can grab the ASTAP installer for Windows or Linux or whatever you're running on, Raspberry Pi. And also make sure that you grab the database. If you don't grab the database, it won't know how to plate solve. It needs the database to understand where the stars are in the night sky. So make sure you grab both the installer for ASTAP and the database. So pretty straightforward. Once you set that up, it's really not a big deal. How wide of a search do you want it to search based on the coordinates you tell it to start from? If you're blind solving, you might make this radius fairly large. If you're starting from a set of known coordinates, this doesn't need to be very big. So we've got plate solving and then the planetarium. So if you're trying to pick out targets and frame or whatever, you can use a planetarium software of your choice. They've got a few options here. Some of the really popular ones. Cartes du Ciel is a free planetarium software, works really well. It's fairly basic as far as the image quality goes for when you're looking at night sky objects, but it works really well, connects to your mount really easily. Stellarium is another popular one, but I know some folks have issues with getting EQ mod set up so that it works well with your scope, and they just switch over to using CDC instead. If you've got the SkyX or something else, you can use that as well. Now, when you pick that, it will ask you if it's hosted over a network. Otherwise, you just kind of leave it alone. If it's on the same computer, you don't need to change anything here. So that's the basic setup. All right. Once you go through this process, you create a profile, set up anything that you want, give it a name, and set up your color scheme, put in your coordinates, all that stuff. It feels like there's a lot, but once you've got it there, you're done. You don't have to keep changing anything. It's already set, ready to go. The only thing you might change is with a portable setup, adjust your longitude and latitude to wherever it is that you happen to be located. Maybe you make a copy of your profile so you don't have to mess with it later and put it back. But either way, that's probably one of the few things you might actually tweak in here. So I've already got my equipment set up. Once I have that, if I load up my profile, I'll pick one of the ones I've already got going on. Use this one. Now I can go over to equipment and I can connect everything. Now, since I'm remoted in, I've turned everything on. I have it inside, so I can't really point it at anything, but I can tell it to scan for things individually if I want to. You'll see that it went ahead, and here's all some different cameras and stuff that you can tell it to look for. But if you're using the same equipment, there's just a connect button here, and it'll connect all the things that it can all at one time. Now, it may not be able to connect everything. If you also have it connecting guiding, then it will fire up PhD2 for you. It connects EQ mod. You can see my scope is currently parked. It fires up PhD2, connects my guide cam, all that fun stuff, so I don't have to do it all manually. I would still have to, in PhD2, tell it to connect my equipment here. So now everything is fired up, it's connected. So I had to turn my camera on, but now it should be able to find it. If I go in here, here's my 7D Mark II, select that, connect it up. So you can do individual pieces. You can do, here's the rotator, you can see just hitting the connect button, it found the telescope already. And if you turn on guiding, right, PhD2, you can connect it, disconnect it as you need to. So we've got all those things connected. Again, they're optional. You don't have to do every one of them. You could just do the camera. You could just do the rotator. You could just do the telescope, the guider. You don't have to do all of these if you don't have them. You could just do what you do have, like just a camera and the telescope. So these are all fired up now. Everything's connected. And I can click on each one, see what their settings are, manually pick things like gain, or if I go to the rotator, I've got a manual rotator, so I can't move it, but if you had a automated rotator, you could tell it to rotate and stuff in here. Now finding stuff inside of N.I.N.A is pretty simple. There are a couple ways to go about it. You can use the Sky Atlas. So what I could do is I could search for something like M42, Orion, a really common target these days, especially in the wintertime. We can really easily find Orion in the night sky. There it is. So I can take that and I can push it over into a sequence or the framing assistant. Another option that you might have is instead of using this, you could go straight into the framing assistant and use whatever you picked out from your planetarium software. So if I'm using something like Cartes du Ciel and I go in, I connect my telescope to it. So now the mount is fired up. So for instance, if I go in here and I find something like, maybe I want to look for the Flame Nebula, which is near the Horsehead Nebula as well. So I can go ahead and find whatever it is that I want, and this is going to at least get me close. So maybe I'll pick something nearby, or you could even choose to try and center on a particular spot, maybe in the middle here somewhere. So once you've chosen a target here, that will potentially be useful when you go over to N.I.N.A. So if I switch back to N.I.N.A, I can actually tell it to find coordinates from my planetarium software. So if I click on that, you'll see it went ahead and found the specific target I was already pointed at. So that might be a great way to do this, because in CDC, you might be able to see your target a little more easily, especially if you're working offline. If you've got internet connectivity, you can actually go into N.I.N.A and you can pick one of these other sky surveys or use the NASA sky survey. It will pull up an actual picture that you can see. But if you're using the offline framing and tell it to load this up, it's going to come in as something that's a little bit simpler. So really not something that you can necessarily see exactly what you have going on. And in that case, I'm going to have to just kind of figure it out, right? We just kind of click and drag until we get something that's pretty close to where I think I want it. It's really not that easy to try and center everything up here. So because I don't necessarily have a great picture of what I'm looking at, I'm gonna have to guess, and I don't really like guessing too much. So I know we've got the Flame Nebula and we've got the Horsehead Nebula, but I don't really know exactly what orientation they're in unless I really know the night sky. So if I'm in something like CDC or Stellarium, if you want, you can actually set up things related to your camera and your telescope. So if I want, I can go into the general settings and I can look at things like the finder circle for an eyepiece or the finder rectangle for a camera. And if I want, I can add my own into here. You can actually just click onto an empty row, give it a width, give it a height, standard rotation and offset, and that will help you make sure that you get everything set the way that you want it. And that way, when you are looking for your target, you can actually see your orientation around your target. I can't see that necessarily without loading up images inside of N.I.N.A. If you're online, then it's not so bad, but if you're offline, they do have an option to load up offline images for the Sky Atlas. but I don't have that in this instance. So I would set up my framing the way I want it, and you can adjust things like your rotation to help you figure out exactly where you want things to go. We go like here, and you want to make sure that your camera parameters are correct. Otherwise, if they're not, like my scope is really more like 580 millimeters, you can see that it's much larger. If you don't have the right focal length, it's going to make it hard to frame the object correctly. Now, once I got my framing good, whether I did it here or I grabbed the coordinates off of my planetarium software and just adjusted something like rotation, once I have that, I can go ahead and add this as a sequence target, or I can just manually slew to it. That's fine. But I can go ahead and set this as my target. When you're on the sequencing section or sequencing tab, setting this up is pretty straightforward. I just give this a name. And actually, this is the Flame and Horsehead Nebulae. And I usually put in a date. And that way, when it names my pictures based on my options, it will actually be pretty darn close. It'll separate my pictures between different imaging sessions based on the date, naming the folder. Once you've got that in here, you can choose to do a handful of things. You can delay the start. So if you need to walk away, let the vibration die down and so on, that's fine. You can start guiding. You can tell it to go ahead and move to the target. So if you're not already pointed at it, it will go ahead and slew there. And then once it does that, you can turn on center target. That's your plate solving. So it will take a quick snapshot, compare it against the database and say, am I pointed in the right spot? Yes or no. If it's not, it will nudge the scope and it will do another solve. It will take another snapshot, try and solve it. Is it in the right spot now? If it's not, it'll keep nudging it until it's within the tolerance that you've set inside of your options for plate solving. So that's pretty straightforward. Once you got that, just make sure you don't set your tolerance too small, like 0.1 seconds or something, 0.1 arc seconds, or within like 0.1 degrees of rotation. If you do that, it's going to make it really tough to get everything spot on. And stacking doesn't need it to be that close anyway. So I usually set it to somewhere like within maybe a couple of arc minutes, depending on the size of your image too, if you're using a long focal length versus short. But if you're using a short focal length, within maybe a couple of minutes, and then also rotation within maybe 5 degrees or something, that's good enough. If you're using autofocus, you can turn this stuff on here and adjust settings. I don't have that. But setting up a sequence, pretty straightforward. You tell it how many images you want. So let's say for light frames, I want 30 light frames. And then what is your exposure time? We'll say 120 seconds. Do you have any filters? I don't. No filter wheel. But if you did, you could pick a filter. You can tell it if there's binning for your particular camera. I don't have that because it's a DSLR. Do you want to dither? So it's going to nudge it just a little bit in between frames so that your stacking can really do a good job of canceling out noise. And then how often do you want to dither? If you're only taking a small number, you'd want to dither probably every frame. If you're doing a large number like 40, 50, 60, 100 images, you might dither every 2 or 3 frames just so that you don't have to waste time while it's dithering. And you don't have to have that many dithers with a large number of frames. And then here's your camera's gain value. So these are my ISO settings for my camera. I could pick that here. If you've got multiple items that you want to do, maybe separate line items for multiple light frames, maybe different gain settings, you could do that. So maybe bump down the gain and shrink my exposure time for imaging, say, Orion's core, right? Because the core is really bright. We might need to do a little bit of HDR so I can take the core brightness down a little bit and really get that detail to come out. So I can do the same thing here. Again, do you want to dither at all? And then it also does other types of frames. So if you want, you can have it do darks. I don't usually do flats here. I'll use the flat wizard on the left-hand side here, but you can. Maybe I'll do bias frames and dark frames because those are pretty straightforward and I have to do those anyway with my DSLR. So I'll add a dark frame in here, same setting. If I've got multiple items, I might have to do settings for each one, dark frames for 400, dark frames for 800, and so on. But I can go ahead and add those. If you do dark frames in here, the dark frames will tell you to put the lens cap on. So it will pause, tell you to put the cap on, and then you click OK or continue to have it start taking darks. So again, really not too bad. If you're using a filter wheel, then you might be able to just switch to a black filter, like an opaque filter that you can use to take dark frames, which is kind of nice. I don't have a filter wheel, so I would just put the lens cap on. Once you've got that, you can go ahead and hit play. I'm not going to do that because I don't want to slew the scope in the house, but you can go ahead and do that and it will turn the scope, start the plate solving, fire up the guiding once it's solved and off and running. You can add multiple targets, so you can do additional sequence items using the plus on the top here. If you want to try and image multiple targets in a single night, I can't do that because I'd have to stay up all night. But if I had a backyard where I could leave it out all night, or maybe an observatory that I could just have my equipment fairly sheltered, maybe I would do that. But you can actually have it do that. You can have it slew to multiple targets, take a bunch of pictures on one target, take a bunch of pictures on another target, take another bunch of pictures on a third target. And it will just do that as long as you want all night long, assuming it's got power. You can add multiple sequence items if you want to. So that's pretty much it as far as the way that N.I.N.A works, how you set it up, how you configure the equipment, how you would start up a sequence, how you would find targets and add them to the sequence. Hopefully this is all pretty straightforward, but if you have comments about anything, just let me know. There are a couple other items, like there's the flat wizard. This is if you want to use N.I.N.A to take flats, it'll try and find the ideal exposure time for you. You would give it number of flats to take. Dark flats, same thing. I'll tell you to put the cap on before it takes those. You can set your camera's gain value for the flats if you want to. It'll use the same value for the dark flats. And then you can tell it the step size, the increment of exposure time to try and find the ideal histogram or ideal exposure time. I'll use this usually like the next day. I'll point it at a white screen and take some flats using the same focus point as the night before. So that's pretty much it. Again, any questions, leave them down in the comments. Otherwise, hopefully this was helpful. If there are additional questions, I might end up making another short video to try and answer some of those. I'm by no means an expert at this, so you may have questions on things like autofocusing or rotating that I don't have equipment for, and I don't know how to do those things yet. But again, leave me some questions, comments, and maybe I'll see you again next time.